Welcome to the Wanderer's History Podcast and to the final part of the short history of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. In the previous episode, I ended it with the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, one of the most important documents of 16th century imperial and European history. I've talked about the life and rule of Charles since his early beginnings from the early 1500s, with Erasmus of Rotterdam's premonitory, if not slightly flattering letter sent to him in his education of a Christian prince. Then I've talked about the turbulences he faced in Germany with the emergence of Protestantism, the numerous Italian wars then against the French, the struggles in the Mediterranean against the Ottomans, Corsairs, and so much more. I have omitted talking about his more personal life, his marriages, and the financial aspects of his rule, especially in Spain. Those I hope to cover in another series looking at the economic and monetary movements of 16th century Europe. Before we continue, I would like to remind you to please hit that subscribe button and notification bell to never miss any new material from the podcast. Let us resume. At the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, Charles V, whose health was severely impacted by gout and illness in general, had sent his brother and future Emperor Ferdinand to sign it in his name. Charles had already begun partitioning the empire between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip, who would become Philip II of Spain. Ferdinand had a much better and functional relationship with the German princes of the empire and would rule over the German parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Philip II would rule over Spain and its New World dominions, but also places like Naples, Sicily, Milan, all reconfirmed under Spanish authority and rule in the 1559 Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. And he would also rule over the Netherlands, where a debilitating war and revolt would commence in 1568. That would be known as the 80 Years' War. This partitioning of arguably one of the largest composite states in early modern history made sense because Philip II would have found it extremely problematic to deal with the Protestant princes of the empire in Germany had he actually become emperor. By this point, Ferdinand was deeply entrenched in the politics and the workings of the Holy Roman Empire, whether this was related to the defense eastwards against the Ottomans or to the solving of the crises arising from the rise of Protestantism in the empire. I will like now to read a few excerpts from an important primary source entitled The Advice of Charles V, Emperor of Germany and King of Spain, to his son Philip II upon his resignation of the crown to his said son, this edition being printed for H. Mortlock in London 1670. The first pages of this source read the following, quote, "Most dear son, no jewels appear so glorious as those that embellish the crowns of princes. Sovereignty is the mistress to which the greatest spirits devote their services, making the universe a theatre of heroic actions to justify their title to the dignity they affect. They have made their regal state an objection of veneration or envy to all inferiors, and given cause to kings to think the earth a stage too narrow whereon to display the beams of their majesty, and the prerogatives of that condition which have no equal under the sun. This hath raised ambition to that height that men trample on all rights, civil or sacred, that obstruct their passage to the throne, and even divest themselves of humanity in offering violence to the laws of nature, that they may with more security put on and wear the royal purple, sacrificing the lives of nearest relations in the interest of the crown. Hence it is that the examples of quitting crowns and resigning scepters are so rare that succeeding ages entertain the relation thereof as fancies, rather than historical truths. So natural to man is this first of independent freedom, that the quitting of that which all desire to enjoy seems a paradox, not to be esteemed true in any case but theirs, who by their incapacity to use that excellent privilege are unworthy to enjoy it, or by pretending a voluntary resignation, think to palliate their weakness and hide their disability to hold that scepter, which, if not yielded, would be wrested away from them, like those vain sophists who decried riches, not out of a real contempt of them, but because they wanted them and knew not how to gain them. End of quote. Later on, Charles extensively talks about the duties and perils of a prince, the risks relating to financial issues, which was ironic given the number of bankruptcies Spain would face during the reign of Philip II. Charles moves on and says in pages 10 to 15 the following, quote, "That you may answer their expectations before I resign my crowns into your hands, I shall give you some directions, which you are to esteem as highly as these diadems, which have derived their majestic luster on my head from the rules you shall receive, more than from those orient diamonds that adorn them. This not my intention to mind you here of those duties of piety to God, temperance, and magnanimity in your actions and justice to your subjects, which are bases of thrones and pillars of sovereignty. For that I am satisfied by your practice, that you have heartily embraced those excellent principles of your education, and that whether you converse with the present or past ages, you cannot want frequent admonitions by men or books to urge the exercise of those fundamental virtues. My design is to commend to your observation some rules and maxims which my experience as Emperor and King of Spain have confirmed useful in the government of those states I shall resign into your hands. When you consider the numerous dominions you are to succeed in Spain, Flanders, Italy, and Germany, with the different constitutions and inclinations of the people, the variety of their laws and politic interests, you will presently conclude that great governments are great burdens, and the prerogatives you enjoy above other princes are but intimations and marks a greater cares and weightier duties incumbent on you. The cares of a pilot are circumscribed within the narrow compass of the ship he guides, but those of an admiral extend to the whole fleet. The vigilance of other princes, like the single states they rule, is short and narrow. Yours must be proportionable to your dominions, dilated from east to west, and reach even to a new world. But you may not be discouraged at the troubles that attend your greatness. Remember that as your government is more weighty and large, so will your glory be, which will run parallel with your cares, and make you renowned in those remote regions where the names of other princes are never heard of. To advise a great prince to be content with the dominions he is born to may seem absurd to them who judge contentment a private virtue only, and extol an insatiable ambition as the greatest glory of a king." End quote. Charles then talks about the dominions more in detail from pages 105 to 108. He goes on to say, quote, "The dominions you succeed in are so many and so populous that they will easily furnish you with the means to raise and maintain a potent army according to the rules I have showed. And if you keep good correspondence and preserve the amity established between us and our allies of the House of Austria, you will, besides the Flemish, Italian, and the Spanish nations, have the Germans at your devotion, who are a mighty and brave people, and make yourself formidable to the greatest powers on earth. Whereas, if you be at discord with your kinsmen of that house, it will impair your authority, encourage your enemies, weaken your power, and cool the affections of your ancient friends. Above all, have due regard and express extraordinary respect for your cousin, the King of Bohemia, as a person of so much worth that the greatest empires are too narrow for the exercise of his excellent virtues. And observe it as a maxim, that though matter of unkindness may sometimes fall out between the nearest relations, yet more good may be hoped from the love that springs out of consanguinity, that the fairest pretenses of amity from a stranger, and that is more glorious to preserve the goodwill and friendship of your kindred by yielding to them in some things to end differences, than by arms to force strangers to a compliance with your will. To conclude this point of training youth, please their humor and encourage their love to war by privileges of wearing weapons, and exemption from the burdens of civil offices. Study an exact knowledge of the situation and nature of all places under your government, wherein their abundance consists, and where their defects supply these, and use the other as means to establish amity between the several members of your empire, making the abundance of one part to fill up the defects of the other, cause plots to be drawn of all their places of strength, mountains, rivers, etc., that by resorting to your map, you may upon occasion order matters with more certainty. Think it worth your pains to inquire not only into the humors and dispositions, but the interests, alliances, and factions of your potent subjects, for the balance of authority remaining in your hand, you may easily make that side most weighty and considerable that is best affected to your service, and prevent all disorders that may ensue upon their engagements in parties against one another. End quote. In page 113, Charles tells Philip II in this letter that his greatest enemy would not be France, but the Ottoman Empire. And he says, quote, "The Turk is your greatest and most certain enemy, both on the account of religion, which you are to prefer before all other interests, and that the violent constitution of his tyrannical government keeps him always on his guard, to secure his power against sudden attempts, and so his forces are ever in readiness to be poured where hope of success invites him, who desires no other cause of quarrel. When I consider the long course of Danubius and the great campaign of Hungary, the situation of Vienna and neighborhood of Germany, with the power of the neighbors on the one side and the desert conditions of the borders on the other, I am induced to believe that he will waive the prosecution of his conquests there for the present, and bend his forces against the islands and your states in Italy, which he will assault before he breaks with Venice. The reason is that if he fall on the Venetian first, he may expect greater opposition by such auxiliary forces as you may send in their aid, but need not fear the Venetians' engagement against him in your quarrel in a time of peace with them, as well for that all republics whether aristocratical or democratical, flattering themselves with hopes of perpetual subsistence, do naturally decline all hazardous undertakings, especially when the tranquility they enjoy and dangers of action represent every alteration for the worse. End quote. This is very interesting because Charles V basically is referring to Philip II about the Third Ottoman Venetian War between 1537 and 1540. He also mentions the very delicate state of affairs between the Republic of Venice and the Ottomans. The Venetians never want to engage into war with the Ottomans and prefer to stay neutral in the conflict that Spain had with the Ottoman Empire. Now, this will be obviously reflected in the conflict that Spain under Philip II will have with Suleiman the Magnificent and then Selim II. Charles also makes references to the borders of the empire, what happened in Hungary with Mohacs in 1526, with the siege of Vienna in 1529, but he also makes references to the situation in Northern Africa, of course, 1535, the conquest of Tunis. And in a way, some aspects of this letter kind of become reality. There are analogies that can be made between the Third Ottoman Venetian War and the fourth one, which involves the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus. Of course, there are differences, mainly the fact that John of Austria substantially aids and betters the Holy League of 1570 as opposed to the one in 1538. Then in page 127, Charles tells Philip about the second rival of Spain and the empire for that matter, someone who was allied throughout the numerous Italian wars with the Ottomans. And of course, we're talking about France. He goes on to say, quote, "The solid strength of the Kingdom of France receives addition of power by the willingness of other princes, and especially the Italians jealous of our forces, to assist that crown against us. Therefore, let us consider next the best way of making war upon the French. Had they known to improve the taking of Cassab or revolt of Siena to the best advantage, we had felt this by dear experiences how much the Italians are inclined to novelty, and the great benefit the French may obtain with inconsiderable charge in the wars of Italy. For though it cannot be doubted but the government of the French, if possessed of those places we hold in Italy, would in a short time become more offensive and insupportable to the inhabitants than ours. Yet such is their itch for change, so great their jealousies of our forces in Milan, Naples, and Sicily, that they throw open their arms to receive any that promise to restore their liberty, which they think lost in the fetters of our power, in the places I have named. But this your happiness, that by assaulting that king in his own dominions, which you can easily do, you will infallibly force him to recall his forces from Italy to defend France, and gladly employ them to quench the fire kindled in his own house, whom he had commanded to burn yours, and have been their maxim long, not to leave an enemy behind them. It must be yours to win and fortify some places of importance in their passage to Italy, which may either stop their further march, or at least entertain their forces for so long till yours be in readiness to receive them by defense, or stop them by diversion." End quote. Basically, Charles is trying to guide Philip into the steps that would follow, and we have that with the peace of or Treaty of Cateau Cambrésis, which basically all but confirms Spanish complete authority in most of the Italian peninsula and drives most French forces out. Of course, the French will be engulfed in their ever escalating wars of religion by this point. Charles then proceeds to tell Philip about the inner workings of most of the Italian republics, the problematic at times relationship that he had with the papacy, especially before the coronation of Bologna in 1530. And between the last pages, so page 160 to 163, he concludes to what I think is basically a manual for Philip II on how to rule Spain and its dominions. So Charles proceeds and says, quote, "These observations, most dear son, I leave with you as rules for your conduct in peace and war. And though the circumstances of things may vary, yet the reason of my advice remaining the same will be useful for direction in most occurrences of state. And now by the duty of gratitude you owe me, your father, your prince and benefactor, I charge you strictly and constantly to observe with reverence the laws of God and conscience, to regard them as the control of your relationships and rules of indispensable obligation in all your actions, that no design, no act, no stratagem can be just or worthy a prince, but what is consonant to them. And amidst the majestic glories of a mighty prince, forget not yourself to be a man, and that the prerogative of your crowns exempts you from the jurisdiction of those tribunals where bribery may corrupt, affections blind, ignorance mislead, fear oversaw, or impotence frustrate the judgment given, to reserve your cause to the dreadful examination and sentence of that judge, who is justice itself and cannot be deceived, who for the sins of princes given their dominions to whom he pleases, without other respects to their crowns, than to aggravate their offense in abusing the privileges of their state, to the contempt of his justice and presuming to commit such transgressions against his laws, which they would not permit to be done by their subjects against theirs. And remember, you are to account to a judge from whom there is no appeal, who inflicts heaviest punishments on wicked princes as immediate offenders against his majesty, and therefore most fit to be made examples of just severity, as good kings are the immediate objects of his care and providence, partake most of his bounty and favors, and are in affection no less than in dignity, nearer to God than other mortals." Finis. End quote. Would like to apologize for any mistakes made reading this document written in the late 17th century, but I think the essence is there. This is a manual of how to rule Spain and its other territories from Charles V to Philip II, his son. And there are some predictions, especially when it comes to the end of the Italian wars, and also how the conflict with the Ottomans would still go on as late as 1581. It is one of those cases in which Philip II ultimately was his own judge and decided to go and take advantage of opportunities, such as was the Portuguese succession crisis. And after 1580, he basically establishes a union with Portugal, and you've got like this Iberian, I would call it, kingdom, the union between Spain and Portugal, which would last until 1640. After his abdication, St. Ignatius of Loyola had to say this about Charles V. Quote, "The emperor gave a rare example to his successors. In so doing, he proved himself to be a true Christian prince. May the Lord, in all his goodness, now grant the emperor freedom." End quote. It is important to reflect after everything we talked about in the previous episodes and try to interpret, as many historians have done before, the reasons for Charles's abdication. Of course, one has to take into account his very poor health, the debilitating suffering derived from his gout. On top of that, there were decades of fighting war after war in the Italian peninsula, mainly against the French. There was the constant tensions deriving from the emergence of Protestantism from the early beginnings of his rule as emperor. And definitely that was one of the landmarks and milestones of his rule, his handling of the Protestant princes and their increasing pressure. Also, the situation at home in Spain required attention, especially in matters relating to debt and his relationship with the Castilian nobility and clergy. The revolt of the Comuneros was a serious initial threat that got extinguished quickly. However, Philip II would inherit a Spanish kingdom engulfed in turbulences, mainly of economic nature. So between 1555 and 1556, Charles V renounced his claims to the Netherlands and Spain in favor of his son Philip, and the claims to the imperial crown in favor of his brother Ferdinand. Charles V retired to the Yuste monastery in February 1557, where he would be visited by Philip II and his half-brother Don John of Austria, who we've talked about in a previous series, the ones looking at admirals of the west of the 16th century Mediterranean. On September 21st, 1558, Charles V passed away, and he was accompanied by monks of the monastery and the Archbishop of Toledo. Arguably, he was one of the most important monarchs in history by that point. Charles's reign reshaped Europe and also had a foundational step for what Philip II would achieve in the second half of the 16th century. In terms of legacy, it is an extremely complex one. He inherited one of the most diverse European kingdoms in Europe, from the Netherlands to Burgundy to Spain and to the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. With Spain, he had one of the largest colonial empires in Central and South America, which brought back substantial quantities of silver, which became one of the pillars of the Spanish economy. I'll hope to talk in the future episodes about Spain and Portugal's colonial empires during the reigns of Charles and Philip II. Returning, we've got Charles V was largely successful against his arch rival, that being Francis I of France. Against Suleiman the Magnificent, that would be a bit more complicated, mainly because Suleiman had the likes of Hayreddin Barbarossa and Dragut Rais. Of course, Charles benefited from Andrea Doria, from his influence and impact in Genoa. Genoa eventually turns against the French, and Doria enlists himself in the service of Spain and Charles. Charles V was a staunch opposer of the Protestant Reformation. He was a supporter of the Counter-Reformation, despite his, at times, troublesome relationships with the papacy. Charles managed to make, as I've said, great use of Andrea Doria and his fleet, being one of the main pillars of his Mediterranean defense against the strength of the Ottoman Navy, which was, at the time, the most powerful. And the outcome of the Battle of Preveza in 1538 basically confirms two spheres of influence within the Mediterranean: the East with the Ottomans and the Venetians, and in the West with Sicily, Malta, under the influence of the Spanish. However, there is reason to think that there were many failings of Charles's rule. A few decades after his passing, we see the the eruption of the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands, which was a revolt against Spanish rule. Half a century later, we would also see Europe tearing itself apart through the 30 Years' War, meaning that the Augsburg Confession in 1555 failed to keep the peace. I'm not saying that Charles V was directly responsible for these conflicts, the 80 Years' War, the 30 Years' War. However, there are consequences of his actions, especially when looking at how he dealt with the Protestants after the brief Schmalkaldic Wars, and his legacy ultimately was part of the reasons why these conflicts emerged. So in the end, I'm happy to conclude the short history of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. Of course, mainly I've talked about issues relating to Spain in the Mediterranean, but also in the empire. And there's only so much you can do over 90 or 120 minutes. I've tried to cover some basic bits of his history, his legacy, why he was such an important ruler. And the next episode, I think there'll be a short episode about his brother Ferdinand. There are some very good sources about that. One of my favorite books is written by Paula Fichtner about the rule and reign of Ferdinand. And then I think we can proceed with a similar series about the rule of Philip II and how consequential and important that was, because a lot of events happened there. We're talking about the Council of Trent, we're talking about the Battle of Lepanto, the Fourth Ottoman Venetian War, what happens with Portugal. It is a very, very important, if not fundamental, part of 16th century European, global, Mediterranean history. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the podcast. I will be making a full episode, so everything from the first episode, covering his early beginnings, those of Charles V, to this one. So that will be kind of an hour and a half episode. I would think they'll just be merged together. Then I'm hoping for an episode on Ferdinand, Holy Roman Emperor, then Philip II. And there will be some short episodes in between with like tier lists, because those have been quite fun. But thank you again for listening. Make sure you're subscribed to never miss any new material from the podcast. And until the next time, all the best.